Hello and welcome to the public meeting of the DC Lodge. We're very honored today to have Jeremy Johnson, an author, talk to us. But before we go ahead and introduce him, I would like to ask you to mute yourself and invite you to read aloud to strengthen the vibration, our invocation by Annie Besant. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness, may all who feel themselves as one with thee know they are therefore one with every other. And with that, I want to thank Jeremy that he is with us today. And I just let me do this. And I'm going to tell you a little bit. So he is a scholar, writer, and publisher at the Revelore Press and founder of Neural Learning. He received his master's in consciousness studies from Goddard College, Vermont, where he studied the intersections of media ecology, integral philosophy, and depth psychology. He is the author of Seeing Through the World, Jean Gebser and Integral Consciousness, and an editor for Mutations, Art, Consciousness, and Anthropocene, and the forthcoming Fragments of an Integral Future, Essays on Reclaiming Time. Jeremy is the current president of the International Jean Gebser Society, editor for Integral Leadership Review, and a senior research associate at Perspectiva. His writing has been featured on Omni, Reality Sandwich Magazine, Conscious Lifestyle, Cosmos Journal, Integral Leadership Review, Evolve Magazine, and Evolve and Ascent. So please.
Sorry, what's that, baby?
And there you are. It's all yours, Jeremy.
Thanks, Suzanne. It's an honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and the interest in learning more about Gebser today. So I know a lot of us have our videos off, but just by a show of hands, is anyone familiar with Gebser or integral theory to some capacity? Sorta? Okay. Yeah, a little bit. Okay, we got some hand raised. Okay, just curious about the how familiar we are in this group. But yeah, so I do have some slides. Today, what I'd like to do is really just bring us through some brief biographical notes about Gebser's life, which I think Veronica kind of touched on in the last session, so I won't dwell too much on that, and really try to the best of my capacity within an hour to go through the structures of consciousness and explore qualitatively and even a little conceptually just what these structures are and what Gebser's overall, not only his methodology, but sort of his cosmology is, and hopefully get us a little bit engaged in this in a qualitative way. Okay, so that being said, let me share the first little PowerPoint. Here we go. Okay, so this is just a quick one for us, just an overview, a snapshot who this individual was. Gebser is one of these thinkers who's alongside folks like Sri Aurobindo. More contemporarily, you are probably familiar with Ken Wilber's work in integral theory. Another great thinker is Teilhard de Chardin, who wrote The Phenomenon of Man. He's famous for popularizing the concept of the new sphere. He's also kind of considered one of these foundational integral thinkers. For a past Gebser conference, we called them Aurobindo, Teilhard, Whitehead, et cetera, as the architects of the integral world, right? These are foundational thinkers who were, for the most part, living in the early to mid-century, and they had a kind of vision. There's different expressions of what integral means. It's both a spiritual expression, but also, you know, let's say in Ken Wilber's work, a kind of a theory of everything, a theory of the whole. But it's a way of relating to the whole, a way of looking at things in a holistic process. What makes Gebser interesting and perhaps unique is in his conception of what integrality means, he moves more into a discussion and a discourse around time and the phenomenology of time. We may have become familiar with the evolution of consciousness from various thinkers, but not all of us are familiar with this idea that, in addition to language changing, in addition perhaps to our values changing or mimetic orientations changing, right? If you look at spiral dynamics with Wilbur, time changes, right? Our orientation relationship with time. So I have here on these slides just a few like starting notes, right? He's most known for the ever-present origin. This is unfortunately the only text that is translated into English in full at the moment, although that is changing in the next couple of years. We're getting some more of his older texts translated, and some of his last texts translated as well. You might call him a phenomenologist of consciousness, and his process, what he described was the phenomenology of awakening or becoming of consciousness. And why phenomenology, right? What does it actually mean? We don't have to unpack the whole philosophical discipline, but for Gebser, this means an orientation or a relation, studying the relationship of time, space, and the experience of being in time and space. What is the experience of being in the world, right? How does that shift and transform? And what are the best ways to deduce that, right? Um, so Gebser very often is looking at etymology, language, art, aesthetics, right? A motif on a piece of on a fragment of let's say like ancient um, stoneware or clay, right? And trying to discern, okay, what does this motif mean for, let's say, the Roman period? What does this say about the relationship with the world? What does two-dimensional art versus, or compared to three-dimensional Renaissance art, uh, tell us about, in terms of how our reflection and perception of the world is transforming? Our reflection and perception of self has transformed. So this is phenomenology for Gebser, the sense of being in the world and our relationship with the world, time, space, and self. He got started really as a poet himself, and as a scholar of poetry. He very early on was very interested in the new poetic movements in percolating in the mid 20th and early 20th century, such as Rilke, a lot of bohemian work, a lot of modernist literature. He was interested in the transformations of grammar and language and what they were doing for not only the artistic movements, but for what he considered a transformation of Europe, right? There was a transformation. He was still seeking the language, but he was essentially looking at this transformation of consciousness through this explosion of the new arts and modernist arts. And this, of course, Gebser being intellectually very curious, moved him into a discussion and an exploration of, well, it's not just the arts, is it? It's also the sciences. A contemporary example might be, let's say, Leonard Schlehn's works on the evolution of, let's say, I think it's called Art and Physics, and how art and physics kind of coincide with one another. Very often, art comes first with a new idea, a new perception. Physics picks it up. But there's an intimacy between the art and the science. And I think you see this in the way Gebser kind of pursues his own study. And I have Disintegration and Participation here as one of his last texts that is also quite good. His last texts tend to be a bit more succinct, but very powerful. Very you might call it a kind of a spiritual transmission, I think, in his last works, which is very much there. So we've gone over his orientation, his approach, this phenomenology of consciousness. We've gone over some of his early texts and some of his early kind of stirrings of looking at this, right? And Gebser, biographically, he was very interested in walking the walk, quite literally. He left his, it was Germany at the time, but there was a lot of, political instability, the rise of fascism. Europe was a very tenuous place to be in the early 20th century. And being uh, a young poet and a scholar of sorts, he caught the wanderlust and started exploring Europe, following in the footsteps of Rilke. He was very good at finding his way into circles, different groups. So he found his way into a lot of artistic circles, particularly in Spain. So he was friends with the likes of like Lorca, the poet. And it was really through Lorca's work, and I think I have the slide here if I could just check really quick. You might appreciate this. Let's see. Yes. Somewhere in here.
Our guy.
Okay, sorry, one second. That's not the right piece. But it was through Lorca's work, really, that Gebser began to feel a sense of this deep and living past, that the earlier structures of consciousness, as he called them eventually, were somehow still alive in us and could be elucidated, could be described. Um, it really, and I find this interesting that it was through a living poet that this kind of presence of the dead, and of the ancestors, in a sense, really kind of came to life for him. Here we go. This is the main slide set that I wanted to share with you guys. Yeah, and I want to share this little biographical note too. This is one of the encounters he had with Lorca. Well, he was living in Spain for a number of years, and I'll just read to you the little journal he wrote about it. And then he read to me with a dark, full voice the tragedy of the nocturnal world, an invocation of the realm of the mothers, where death is life and life death, where the as yet unseparated threatens to tear itself into dream, sleep, and twilight, where the inexpressible is at once gentle and raging, where the consciousness of chaos has not yet departed, regardless of the discovery that would have the opposites raised into conscious correspondence. He read completely absorbed as the shadows overtook his olive-colored face, and as he finished, darkness fell. So Lorca was his friend. He was very influenced and moved by him, and I think, there's two elements here that are really vivid and come to life, and one is this intuition that there is another way of being in the world, right? There, in the archaeology of consciousness, there's a different way of relating to, let's say, the dead. There's a kind of non-differentiated state that he was intuiting here, and talking about not being separated yet, right? It was just at the threshold of breaking forth. And there's some language in here that may not be familiar with for you, unless perhaps you're familiar with Jung, talking about the opposites raised into conscious correspondence. For Gebser, this is yet another structure, but it kind of moves from non-differentiation to polarity to unstable polarities, right? And becomes more oppositional rather than complementary. And that may sound abstract, so I'm not going to dive into that quite yet, but the vividness of this should come to our attention. Um, and this is what Gebser called early on the unperspectival era, the unperspectival epoch, which is a very kind of um, uh, I wouldn't say vague exactly, but it sort of contains a few of the structures of consciousness he will eventually distinguish. But he describes it this way, and I thought this was always a very helpful way to talk about what he is intuiting from Lorca here. And he's using images. Again, here's a thing that if you ever pick up Ever Present Origin, you will probably need Google or a deep literacy of the arts that he's going to be referring to, because he will refer to particularly European and medieval European art, particularly in this part of the book. But he will cite a lot of images and a lot of artists in the classic sense that you may have to become familiar with. But as he's describing this, he's saying these pictures of an unperspectival era are, as it were, painted at night when objects are without shadow and depth. Here, darkness has swelled space to the extent that only the immaterial psychic component could be expressed. And for Gebser, this is what is really kind of coming to the forefront for him in exploring this history of consciousness. This is the kind of qualitative dimensionality of the unperspectival world, of the world that Lorca is invoking through his poetry, and that this is still alive in us somehow, right? And I want to now, to help us get a sense of, well, I'll leave us with a koan first, of sorts, that will hopefully make a little bit more sense as we move into more of a discussion. But in the sense that the presence of the dead and the presence of the past and the history of consciousness is still alive in us, for Gebser, the flip side of that intuition is that the future is also alive in us, not just the past, but the future as well. What we are becoming is latent in the present. What we have become in our vast history, our vast wealth of becoming, is latent in us in the present. Um, and maybe as one more biographical note, uh, what was very important for Gebser in his Spanish years was what he in 1931, 1932, in the winter, he described as this lightning like flash of inspiration, where he intuited something along these lines that I'm describing, the kind of potency of the present, the vibrating emptiness of the present, where the past, present, and future are somehow held. And he couldn't exactly articulate this at the time, but it was later. I mean, it really took him from the 1930s through, publishing Ever Present Origin to really articulate what happened there, in that particular lightning like flash of inspiration in the early 30s in Spain. I want to leave actually a few more notes that you might find interesting. In Paris, he actually befriended a number of the resistance, the French resistance, and intellectual thinkers. I believe I think it was Sartre in his group, and a number of other sort of intellectuals in a particular circle. But I don't really want to dive into that. But I do want to mention that when he finally made his way into Switzerland, a few hours before the border closed, he actually ended up befriending and getting associated with the Eranos lectures. So Carl Jung was an associate. A lot of the Eranos folks of the time were associates of his. So once again, he just found himself in a very interesting circle. And I do think that some of his commentary in his later books is a result of some conversations, particularly with I think with Jung. There's a few interesting anecdotal ones that I'd be happy to share, maybe in the discussions part of this presentation. So let's go through this. Let's begin this. We've already kind of had a little stirring of what this unperspectival world is, but let's differentiate it a little bit more. So there's three of these worlds that Gebser refers to that I think are worth noting: unperspectival, perspectival, and aperspectival. Um, you've heard unperspectival. You haven't really heard perspective or aperspective, but I will just say this: think about when you're in an art class, even an introductory one. They talk about depth perspective, being able to draw perspective. I don't want to reduce what that means to merely, an art class terminology or an art style terminology, but it's a good way to talk about the kind of perception of world that Gebser is describing here, right? As we said earlier, as Gebser was mentioning in that quote about the images that are almost dreamlike, that the psychical interior world is really what comes forward and not the kind of hard three-dimensional world. That's the unperspectival, right? Perspective is more, our spatial awareness. We're going to get into this now a little bit clearer as we go through the different structures. So Gebser has this terminology, perspectives, this perspectival terminology. But for a closer study after the 30s and through the 30s into the 40s, he started to differentiate and actually identify particular structures of consciousness with unique expressions of time and space that couldn't be just summed up as unperspectival, perspectival, and aperspectival. There was more qualitative shifts and changes going on, so it required a better language. So let's move through it. First of all, Gebser called these structures of consciousness. And I use this term. A few other Gebserian colleagues use this term, that is ontological, right? It's a relationship with being. What is being, right? Is there a reality behind our psychic life that would have a profound ontological shift if we believed that, right? And many of us do, I suppose, in the consciousness culture. Or if we didn't as well, right? If the mind in the interior world is epiphenomenal, we have a different orientation to what is being, right? Is thinking being? Is dreaming being, right? Our relationship with being shifts and changes here. These are very kind of deep tectonic plate level restructurings that take place in the evolution of consciousness at the level of being. And these transformations, Gebser calls, of these structures are mutations. They're not gradual. They're very often, they go through kind of a period of leaping forward in a sort of frenetic newness, a creative overdetermination, and then a kind of a crystallization and a rigidifying and a shrinking, perhaps a calcification is a good way to talk about it, where they become brittle, they break apart, they go through a crisis, and then a new structure of consciousness kind of leaps from the present, into our cultural phenomenology. We'll show you one of those, the one that we're most familiar with in our own recent, within 500-year history. And this is an interesting phrase, and I wanted to I throw this in here from one of his later books, The Invisible Origin. These mutations, he calls them the crystallization of visible reality from the invisible. So each of these structures, each of these leaps are what Gebser considered to be both historical, as in they happen in our sense of linear time, but also somehow outside of time, somehow ever present, timeless and spaceless. These are kind of they have a spiritual origin to them. Um, One of the phrases Gebser uses in EPO, ever present origin, is when he's talking about the structures, he's also talking about the history of the dateless, and he refers to poetry as the history of the dateless. Um, and I love that phrasing. I don't know if it was Gebser or he was quoting somebody, but the history of the dateless is such a beautiful way to describe it. And I think the crystallization of the visible reality from the invisible is another good way to describe it. So these have a spiritual origin, and we haven't even gotten to the meaning of origin yet. And that's very obtuse, I think. You can't really go at it directly. So I'll say just for the moment that origin for Gebser, if you look at the German wrong, Ursprung, there's an interesting, it's doing something a little bit more than the English translation of origin, in that it's giving us an image of something springing forth, right? So we might, in a more vague language, describe it as source or the Godhead, or Gebser also described it as the spiritual. He also described origin as the itself. It is our origin, but it is also originating moment to moment in the present. So that's why it's ever present. So the language that we have to go to in order to describe origin, I don't think is necessarily only cosmological. It's also contemplative. I think the world's contemplative traditions have good ways to describe what Gebser was intuiting here. And mind you, Gebser was not a practicing contemplative. He was not a practicing mystic of any sort. Although certainly I think he had a disposition for this in a way that was quite profound. And if we have time later, I can also mention a few other events that happened in his life. I think he was very prone to what we might call in the contemporary times a peak experience, right? He was certainly, I believe, he certainly was a mystic. William Irwin Thompson calls him an intellectual mystic. So just kind of giving us some context for what origin means. It's a spiritual origin, and it's the kind of thing that contemplatives try to talk about and articulate in their own writings. So, that being said, these structures of consciousness originate from this ever-present origin. This creative plenum is another description he uses. We participate in this moment to moment. All of the different modes of being in the world, all of these different ontologies are all participating in origin consistently. They're never not, right? But their crystallization in time, in history, and space is very interesting, and that's what I'd like to kind of get into now. And Gebser identifies 5, archaic, magic, mythic, mental, and integral. If you are wondering about the unperspectival and perspectival world and how they fit in here, my shorthand that makes this a little easier is that the archaic, magic, and mythic all kind of fit under that umbrella of unperspectival. The mental fits a bit better with the perspectival, and the integral, of course, the only one left here, aperspectival. And we're going to get into what those mean, I think, once we go through the structures, the last two, perspectival and aperspectival. As we hit those structures, we'll talk about that. So, what is archaic? Well, I think you got a little hint of that from that Lorca story from Gebser, this sense of non-differentiation, where the opposites haven't been raised, where dreaming hasn't even
Jeremy,
happened.
could
Sure.
you have the slide take the whole screen?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Here we go. Let me hit that button again. Here we go. Is that better? Can you see that?
Yeah, thanks.
Fantastic. Great. So the archaic. Dreaming hasn't even happened yet. This is Feuerstein's words, I believe. He describes the archaic as maximum latency. Now, latency is a really important concept for Gebser. All of the different structures of consciousness are latent in the present, right? So that means, in the archaic, the whole unfolding of consciousness is somehow, in some way, present and latent. You might say like an acorn, but it's not quite like that either necessarily. That's a more morphological metaphor, but there's a dynamic interaction in the present of all of these different latent unfoldings. So the future affects the present for Gebser. I'll just give you a taste of that and let you sit with that comment. And we could explore what that means. I think it requires us to not have any definitive answers about what that means. But the archaic, maximum latency, as Feuerstein describes. And as I say here, each of the structures of consciousness has its unique excellence. It's more like a sense perception than a stage. So we're going to get into what I mean here. Because I do give some examples about the gut or the ear, right? Sense organ, hearing and seeing, feeling with our whole body, our intuition. These are different capacities we have that don't necessarily build on each other in an explicitly linear way, so that the higher, let's say the eye, is somehow better than the ear in all cases, right? These structures are more complementary to one another. And I mentioned this here. I mean, I just call the slide darkness and light. And I have the image here, which I used for last year's Gebser course, giving us a sense of complementarity. The darker, dreaming, magic, mythic, archaic, and then the awakening consciousness are part of a whole. So we already explored this one about the unperspectival world and these psychistic images, this dreamlike reality, the presence of the dead, right? But then, maybe I can pause here actually and go back here to give you another taste here of the magic structure of consciousness, in the sense that the magic for Gebser is that first little inkling of differentiation, right? It's that first little separation between, let's say, the tribe and the rest of the world, right? There's a deep participation that's still there. And in fact, the emphasis is really how readily the magical structure of consciousness can yield to the other, that is interpenetrating with the other. And by the other, I mean, to give you a concrete example, this cave painting clip up here, image of the sort of weaving of the animals to denote movement. And this is a painting in a I believe it's a Chauvet cave in France. But there's a interpenetrating of all things with all other things. If you have ever done drumming or any kind of rhythmic work that you kind of go into, you kind of space out, you lose a sense of time. You lose your sense of self. If you're a musician, if you're an artist, you might have this with high periods of creativity or performance. Sometimes runners get this sort of runner's high. There's a kind of beautiful kind of fusion with the thing that the doer and the doing are one, right? This is a little taste, I think, of the magical structure of consciousness, where there's a liminality between yourself and the world, yourself and the other, yourself and what you're doing. And for Gebser, this is also a kind of a collective sense of self that begins to emerge with human beings, not as individuated as the modern atomized, rational self would be, but a person who is able to move in and out of becoming other, and even in and out of becoming animal. Think about the context in which the archaic and the magic arose historically, just in terms of their crystallization. The magic world in the Paleolithic, most of the world was the non-human world. The humans were just living in it, right? So there's an interpenetration of the human and the non-human and the magical as well. And in terms of magic, we're talking also about spell weaving. We're talking about literal weaving in cosmology. This is talked about quite a bit with a lot of indigenous cultures. Use basket weaving to tell their stories, or tapestry weaving to weave their cosmology. This threading together of the world and the cosmos and the self and the cosmos is very much a part of this. I would also say, Gebser emphasizes the magic structure being timeless. So there's a sense of timelessness. To give you an example of this, I would probably point to a different cave location, perhaps Lascaux, where archaeologists go in there and they figure out when a particular bison was painted. And sometimes there are gaps between an artist or a particular usage of the cave. And sometimes those gaps are as long as 7,000 years, where a new population, a new generation picks it up and starts painting again. But there's a 7,000 year gap and the images look identical. So just a tremendous amount of time to the point where calling it deep time, calling just the scope of it is immeasurable for a modern to even consider, for that kind of lived culture to just sort of be in the world. So that gives you that sense of timelessness, right? The scope and length and duration of time expanding so far, it doesn't even make sense to count it anymore. Now, the other thing, though, and I don't know if I have this here. Yes. Okay. So I don't think I missed anything here. Yeah, before I move forward, one other thing about the word and the etymology of magic. Magic Gebser's always doing this throughout all of his writing. He will invite you to participate in your own use of language and become much more aware of the root meanings of particular words. And he traces magic to mag as the root, and its association with make, with machine, with might. There's an interesting intimacy of magic as a word and our technological age, of course, with the machine, right? Mechanical. So I want us to kind of hold that and think about that, perhaps for the discussion as well. I mentioned in this note, like Charles Taylor, the buffering of the self is a word description. Charles Taylor, who he describes the kind of the individuating process of the self, where we create a buffer from the world and from the non-human, and that how our ancestors really didn't have that as much, or if we did, it was much more permeable. It was much more open and dynamic and liminal, right? We moderns don't really have that so much anymore without really working at it. So another aspect that I can't skip, to hear is to belong. And in German, there's a word, hören, I'm probably saying it wrong, to hear, and gehören means to belong. So there's an intimacy in hearing and belonging. And speaking of organs of perception for the different structures, for the magic, for Gebser, it's auditory. And I find this an interesting connection and overlap with, let's say, the Marshall McLuhan, who is that media theorist who was famous for the medium is the message, right? Or the world is a global village. McLuhan is an integral thinker in his own right. And, we could do a talk about that sometime. It's very fascinating. But one of the things I borrow from McLuhan to make this point is how intimate hearing is with this magical structure. When you talk about hearing, right? When you talk about acoustics and music and percussion, I think about the caves that we've been sort of meditating on at first here. You can't really divide up sound the way you can divide up sight. You can bring your attention to a particular object, but your whole body is just immersed in undulating sound, right? Let's say you're in a theater, right? That's a modern day experience of the cave, or at a concert, right? At an amphitheater, in a concert where you're enclosed in the participation of this music. You can feel it on your skin, you know. Um, you can only really divide up music if you are, going on a computer and splitting the tracks and the different instruments on the tracks, right? But in your embodied experience, sound is difficult to cleave apart. You have to holistically experience the whole. And this is what McLuhan often talks about for the pre-literate oral cultures being acoustic, right? Their sense of sense making, of knowing the world is through hearing. And the analogy for the world is that kind of resonant participation. Very much what Gebser's pointing to here, with hearing and belonging being intimate with each other. Another element before we jump to the magic, to the mythic, is the vital nexus. I talked about this in terms of how, we'll just think about the way an ecosystem works and how well our ancestors were very aware of those interdependencies. There's a vital eating and becoming other and becoming eaten, right? There, everything is this intimate web and mesh of vital forces and energies, or spirits as well, which also participate in this kind of ecological style of thinking. So this is the kind of cosmology that you're weaving into. Speaking of, again, tapestries and basket weaving and cosmology, this is the vital nexus that you participate in and that the human participates in. And there's some, I'll skip over this, but for those who are curious, this is a good book that talks a little bit about how some of these themes carry over into some of the early states. The presence of the dead in the underworld in Catalhuyuk, particularly. The families would bury their ancestors literally beneath where they slept, beneath their homes. And the way to access these spaces were descending from the roof, kind of going into a cave or a womb. It's very interesting images here, but we don't really have time to unpack them. For the mythic, so this kind of moves us out of that one point is all points of the magic. Everything's interdependently, vitally enmeshed, and moves us more into the sense of time. And Gebser says that the soul came into being simultaneously with the sky. He's quoting Plato there as a sort of giving us a demonstration or case in point. With the mythic comes that first quote I shared from Gebser talking about Lorca, the opposites raised into conscious polarity, right? They're consciously raised into complementarity. And as Gebser says, the essential characteristic of the mythical structure is the immersion awareness of the soul. Magic man's sleeping like consciousness of natural time is the precondition for mythical man's coming to awareness of soul. Now, what's interesting here for this structure, I want to emphasize the temporics that this is bringing up. I have an image here, of course, of the spinning sky. It looks like a globe, but I'll just say this note, a little bit of a differentiation from Gebser. I don't think there was ever a pure magic timelessness. Most evidence we have from the Paleolithic already demonstrates a sense of understanding the cycles and the rhythms. Being in nature, you need that. The rhythmicity of the cosmos, the rhythmicity of the seasons are very much present, pre-agriculture. There's plenty of examples of lunar calendars and star charts, etc., in the Upper Paleolithic. So I want to say, like, we can bring the mythic back there too. Maybe it wasn't as pronounced, but it was definitely there. So it's a coming to awareness of the stars, of the sky, of inner time, right? Cosmological time. All of us are probably familiar with this to some degree. If you have had any contact with astrology, Western astrology is perfectly fine as an example. I mean, even in the, what do you call it, in the newspapers with a little, your little horoscope, right? I mean, there's a sort of a sense in which we're moving through an archetypal process of meaningful qualitative time that moves in rhythms and cycles. We move in and out of these things. pretty much universally, all cultures have had some kind of a cyclical calendar that's associated with astronomy, that's associated with particular archetypes, presences, qualitative different forms of time that move into different forms of time and move in these great cycles, small and large. So time really comes alive here. But what also comes alive, as we were studying earlier, those images, right? Think of the images in the cave, or that medieval painting Gebser was talking about, the presence of the dream world. Um, there's now a complementarity between earth and sky, and sometimes there's a mediational thing between, earth is the middle plane and then heaven and the underworld. But there's this polarity that starts to emerge, and it's complementary, night and day, darkness and light. um, these complementary movements and oscillations become very important. Yeah, that's what I mentioned. Lunar calendars from the Paleolithic. Here's probably an image of the goddess. I think this is from Lascaux. I'm not 100% sure. But she's holding a conch or something along those lines, which denotes lunar time as well. And then even if we just move all the way up into agricultural states, we have examples of this as well in terms of, descending into the underworld with Hades and returning in the spring. I think it's Persephone. And again, with the mythic, it's image making, it's soul making. It's an awareness of going within and coming back out. The internal world comes to life. The world of images comes to life. And there's also a complementarity between speech and silence. And this is what Gebser says: myth is the closing of the mouth and eyes. Since it is a silent, inward-directed contemplation, it renders the soul visible so that it might be maybe visualized, represented, heard, made audible, right? Listening to the mysteries, partaking in the mysteries, and sharing them, right? Hearing the myths, being moved by the muse, right? Sing in me, muse, is how many of the Greek myths begin, right? In terms of where you're hearing it, you're hearing it with the kind of an inner ear, right? Becoming silent and tuning into the muses or your daemon who speaks to you, right? But you must be silent to hear, and then speaking these stories. So there's this movement in and out that Gebser's talking about here with myth. He says myth is this representing and making audible, the articulation, the announcement, the report. What in one instance is a mute image is in another a sounding word. What is viewed inwardly as in a dream has its conscious emergence and polar complement in poetically shaped utterance. So speech and silence. And he talks quite a bit about, ancient images of masks or mouthless faces, right? That emphasize the silence, that emphasize the structure of consciousness. So we're jumping ahead, just for brevity's sake, or an attempt at brevity's sake, to explore the mental now. Now, so for this, this is quite a profound jump that Gebser talks about. And in his language, he calls it a rupture, an event that almost could be capitalized, a quake in being, right? Three-dimensionality in the mental is, again, this awakening and moving out of this relationship with the interior life, with these qualitative cycles and rhythms of time in the world, and really a kind of an awakening of the separate sense of self. And a move towards directed spatial thinking. And also, he talks about the eye being the organ of perception for this, right? The eye is very much a good mental directive organ, right? It's important for hunting and hunting animals, right? That need to have a kind of perception and know where they're going. If you've ever seen a bird, dive and catch a fish, right? A lot of predators have their eyes moved forward so that they're facing forward rather than the side. They've evolved to kind of look forward. So there's directedness in the mental, which is very important. And we're moving away from the making of images to concepts. You might say, I don't know if I have this quote in here. I do, from Parmenides. Now, Parmenides was certainly not just a mental thinker, but I think this illustrates that movement. And he says, for thinking and being is one and the same. So thinking and being, right? This ontological quake is what is occurring here. Another good example is Protagoras saying, man is the measure of all things, right? So we're moving more into abstraction. We're moving into this, as Charles Taylor says, the buffering of the self that stands apart and can look back on the world with their eyes, with their concepts, with their directed waking thought to go, okay, well, what can I measure? What is real? What can I know? And also, can I know myself? Right? Am I sufficiently awake enough not to just be dreaming and dreaming, but to know myself? Now, there's a certain interesting etymology in the mental as well, in that it means wrath, mens, wrathfulness, um, which is interesting, and it goes along the lines again of that sense of uh, directed, almost oppositional kind of stepping onto the battlefield. And I use the image here of Athena, um, being birthed from a very tired, fatigued-looking Zeus. Um, she, in her kind of origin story, Zeus gets very jealous of Athena's mother, so I think he eats her. But that doesn't stop this child from being born. She splits open his head, right? So there's this rupture. And what Gebser likes to talk about, this rupture of being, this ontological quake, breaks open that mythic world of participation. We no longer want to be involved in the world. We want to know ourselves and individuate. So we rupture ourselves from this enclosure, from this participation. We step out of that magic mythic cave, right? And so it's a perfect illustration here in the myth of just literally the cave of the skull being ruptured by Athena, who ends up being kind of the overseeing patroness of Athens, where the academy was born. She's also fully armored. She's birthed fully armored with a spear, that directed spear. She has eyes of an owl, right, that can see at night, that could pierce through the darkness of myth and magic, and liberate us to some capacity. We have to remember mental is not necessarily, obviously, it's not a bad thing in itself. It's differentiation. It's a structure. And as Gebser says, it has its origin in origin. There's a spiritual quality to this capacity to know thyself. So as difficult as this is, this rupture in being, it also enables us to have these new capacities of self-knowledge, of abstraction, right? And then also, one of the things I didn't mention or dive into too deeply is that each of these structures, historically, when they calcify and rigidify, very often they almost are like a flood, like um, the mythic, the push against the desire for the mental individuation is also this desire not to be suffocated by myth, not to be absorbed in the mysteries, but to have a sense of self that can stand above them and know them in an independent way, and not simply be claimed by them. So there's this overwhelm of the mythic. It becomes a kind of flood. And the arising of mental as this new eruption, this new discernment, is welcomed. It's a remedy. It's liberation, right? Each of these structures, very often, when they erupt and leap and crystallize, there's some kind of liberatory thing happening, right? Where the older structure, historically speaking, is trapping us somehow. It's not satisfying us. There might be a physical material crisis or a spiritual one, which this emergent structure can answer for, right, and help us see through. So the mental thinking, of course, as beautiful as we can say this is, we find ourselves, and this is good as we're getting to the hour here, we find ourselves at another kind of threshold, where the styles of thinking, associating thinking with being, with the spatial world, with measurement, with cleaving things apart, is also, like the mythical world, exhausting itself. Gebser says, there's a type of thinking that's associated with the mental. It's pyramidal, right? perspective, the self and the other, in painting and in art. Once again, to give you a good illustration, literally, the vanishing point depicted in a two-dimensional image, right, of three-dimensional space, the event horizon, right? That's pyramidal thinking. That's perspectival thinking. And as he says, unity can I'm writing this, unity can no longer be achieved by identity, one and all, or mythical complementarity, but only now in thinking through the dialectical process of thesis, antithesis, and temporary synthesis. It always has to be remade. Abstraction isn't the same thing as myth in that sense. It's not universal. It's a concept. So it's a fall from time into space, from mythical time into space, as Gebser describes here. And here's some very early images of I think this was a manifesto kind of illustration of how to draw perspective from the Renaissance period. So space erupts, space overtakes the three-dimensional world, and the reality that we have been living in for the past few hundred years has really taken hold, right? And only recently have we begun to see a kind of remedial process of the earlier structures coming back, in a sort of a healthier way, although that is not always the case. I don't really have time to go into this one or that one, but suffice to say, we're inhabiting or in a time of crisis as well, that the perspectival world and the mental world is breaking down. And it breaks down in a particular way. Think of that pyramid, the fragmentary nature of that pyramid, where everybody has their own kind of myopic, perspectival, totalizing vision. Everyone has their own. What used to be a ground that we could stand on, where we can take measurement and say, okay, this is a fact. This is three-dimensional space, and this is how we make our knowledge. This is our epistemic approach. We talk about this all the time today. There's a knowledge crisis. There is the post-truth world crisis, right? There's the inability to have a shared world anymore. This is very much what the perspectival breakdown looks like. And this is actually what Gebser was talking about back in the 1940s. He's describing the current state of our affairs almost perfectly. But I don't want to dwell on that too much, especially for the brevity of this discussion. But what we have as an opportunity now is the possibility of a new structure. What would that new structure be like? What would its qualities be like? What would we be bursting out from, if that we're going to use that metaphor? And also, what is intensifying? What is leaping from origin right in the present? For Gebser, this has to do with time again. If the perspectival mental world is three-dimensional, for Gebser, the fourth dimension is an introduction or a way of beginning to talk about the integral world, or as he says, the aperspectival world. And this, if the perspectival world was a fall from time into space, then the integral world is a move back from space into time, but not the same kind of time as the mythical world. Not just talking about those different rhythms, those different cycles, and not just talking about tuning into the mysteries and the inner imagistic world. Rather, for Gebser, the integral world is a bringing forth or bringing forward of origin itself. Origin itself, which alone, for Gebser, is able to hold the magic, the mythic, the mental, the archaic. Origin and originary consciousness is an intensification that allows us to, in a certain sense, see through the world, hence the title of my book. Its quality is diaphaneity or transparency, the rendering transparent and becoming present of the plenum of the conscious of the wealth of our consciousness and the history of our consciousness is able to shine through and be present. For Gebser, this is really the only adequate level of response, right? The adequate intensification of consciousness necessary to resolve and respond to the breakdown of the perspectival mental world, which is currently deeply shattering. And time becomes the theme. And as he says here, now is the state of deep sleep is a characteristic of the archaic, a sleep-like state for the magic, a dream, remember, image-like state for the mythic, and wakefulness for the mental. a mere conscious illumination of these states, which are for the most part only dimly conscious, right? Like, okay, talking about this, even as we did right now, is only touching on these things. It doesn't achieve anything necessarily. It says, in fact, to illuminate these states from consciousness is to destroy them. It's like peering under a rock with a flashlight. All the little critters are going to go scurrying away back into the darkness. We can't render those structures conscious with just the waking mind. This is the shift, and this is the crisis of the integral leap, right? We can no longer rely on the waking mental world, just as we could no longer exclusively rely on the mythic or the magic. What's required to come forward now is this integral wearing, or a wearing, as Gebser describes it, which needs to come forward. And as he says here, only when they are integrated via concretion can they become transparent in their entirety. Concretion means, make something concrete, tangible, embodied, right? Vivid and alive in its suchness. This is not done from any one of these little structures alone, archaic, magic, mythic, mental. Only the integral, only the originary can truly do this. And part of this for Gebser, again, is this shift into time. Part of the answer and response and concern historically he's interested in is the theme of time and the crisis of time and modernity in the 19th and 20th centuries, and now certainly in the 21st. And we don't have enough time in the linear sense to really unpack what all of that means, but I think we can get a taste of it, especially this past year, and how much time really came to the forefront. There were so many jokes in the media about every week there was something historical happening that just blew us away. Every week there was something new, which was very often alarming and of concern. But also our sense of time was compressing. There was a sense of time intensifying, a sense of history bubbling up, a sense of time stretching and shrinking. And then our passage of time in terms of our rhythm of the 9-to-5 job, everything was disrupted. So 2020 was a year of temporal disruption by so many means. And also with, for Gebser, speed in history and modernity it becomes an increasing obsession. Things are going faster and faster. Industries are running away, right? Our economic system, which is very one directional, very perspectival and mental. You can only go forward. You can only make more next quarter, right? It's entirely based on that. That has run away from us. And we talk about this with the climate crisis as an existential risk. So time has become the concern and the crisis of the mental perspectival world. And on the flip side, it also becomes an invitation for us to explore what time in origin and an integral time could mean. And as he says here, just to kind of wrap it up, by integration, we mean a fully completed and realized wholeness, the bringing about of an integrum, the reestablishment of the inviolate and pristine state of origin by incorporating the wealth of all subsequent achievement, the concretion of everything that has unfolded in time and coalesced in a spatial array is the integral attempt to reconstitute the magnitude of man from his constituent aspects, so that he can consciously integrate himself with the whole. I'll give you one or two early examples Gebser offers us. This one's Seeing Through Space by this is Jacopo da Pontormo, who I think was a student of Da Vinci's. And there's a kind of a haunting way that his images and the eyes in these paintings really look through space and look through time at you. He mentions that as this sort of breaking out of the enclosure of perspectival space of the painting to see through into this kind of timeless and spaceless adimensionality. He also mentions Picasso as kind of exploring this sort of multi-dimensional imagery, sort of trying to concretize time in a two-dimensional image to sort of really realize the wholeness of time through two-dimensional art as an early exploration. And just to kind of leave here, and then we can open up because there's so much more to talk about, but I'd love to hear some feedback and questions. As he says, origin itself is transparent, unbound to darkness or brightness, which are simply attributes of manifestation. Attributes of manifestation. It's a letter from George Feuerstein. we can talk about what that actually means, but for Gebser, there is a spiritual quality that comes forward in the individual here. It's not just a concern with how we depict time and fourth dimension and all that stuff about modernity. There's a very intimate and personal way that the self is opening back up. If we have a movement of crystallization and individuation, the integral is a kind of a clarifying and a rendering transparent of the self without undoing what has been accomplished by this history of consciousness. So I think I'll leave it here and maybe open it up to questions and comments. So thank you.
Hi, Jeremy. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say. I'm such a Gebser fan, and I remember when I read his book, I went to the National Gallery to understand, from the art perspective, his point of view. But I want to open it to questions for others. And so the first one is you can unmute yourself, or you can raise your hand. So Veronica goes first, and then next is Desiree. Go ahead.
Hi, Jeremy. I cannot thank you enough. I mean, it's a dream come true. I never thought you would accept the invitation because you're so busy. So I really thank you so much. I just have a quick question, and it's hard to explain based on the integral only. Do you consider that at this moment in time, no pun intended, we have the resources in our consciousness to live through it, to make it happen?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's a big question. Are we gonna make it, or I have a sense of optimism, but it's guarded by an acknowledgement that historically these mutational periods tend to require a real kick in the pants, and our culture, our structure of consciousness, or in our modern globalized state, I mean, our industrial civilization is really stubborn. It really wants to go on doing what it's doing, and it's really good at totalizing those structures and really kind of going forward with them. And what was I guess heartening to see this past year is those disruptions really getting people to think differently. People talking about, we need a new worldview, we need a new economic system, we need a new relationship we need a new definition of self. I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson's article in the New Yorker was just great. He was saying there's a new theory of what it means to be a person. And to be a person is to be a society. People are made of societies. Societies are made of societies. So there is this shift that's happening. My realistic response is we will need a series of quakes in our being like we saw last year. Those are probably going to continue regardless. And we'll probably need a lot more of them before we really respond adequately. The heartening thing is that I have seen so many good leaps and interest and revival of these kinds of questions in a way that is much more systemic than it was a few years ago. So I think it's coming. We're still in a tenuous space. So open question.
Well, thank you so much. So the next ones is Desiree, and then Sue, and then Adrian. So Desiree, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Jeremy. Thank you. That was a great talk, really interesting. And of course, it looks like we could have gone on and like just really, so I look forward to learning more, especially of these people that I'm not familiar with. But I wanted to say, as an artist, I really appreciated, like I was kind of getting into that part about understanding the perspective, the perspective and all that, and kind of seeing it that way as what it represents, that it was about the story, not about the space. And then it was more about the physical world. And then, of course, I jumped forward to saying non-representational art, but it represents something more internal and world-like. And I just want to say something that came to me when you were talking about this next step, this next transition. The word entanglement, in quantum physics came to me, and ties in. This is just more like I'm just speaking my aha, which I don't know if it means anything, but the word entanglement, as well as, of course, most of us, what you're talking about, a lot of us refer to as the Akashic records, that there is everything is now. There is that all knowledge, all of everything is available to us, future, past, and current. And then entanglement came in a more energetic way, as sort of like things, as we here in Theosophy talk about the expansion and the return. And it's anyway, so that these images came to mind, is that it's like going back toward the center, the entanglement and the reconnection, and everything returning to integrated, integrating everything back to where it came from. So that's just my aha. And so thank you. It helped my brain start to squeak.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. I just as like a brief note, entanglement, the word itself hasn't come up too much in my circles, but like a lot of analogs to that word, a lot of like similar words, like people talk about hyper objects in my community, or the Cthulhu scene, tentacularity, Donna Haraway's word. Everything, she says, the world is really tentacular, right? You're kind of involved. Or the philosopher Tim Morton talks about like it's the age of hyper objects. Everything's sticky. Like we're all involved in these sort of invisible, entangled processes of, let's say, the climate crisis. But not just that, like in the positive, right? The planetary dynamics of the earth, we're involved in that, whether we realize it or not, And I think part of the theme here is becoming aware of that reality, and either like living or dying by it. Basically, like, are we gonna learn the reality that we're in, right? This is really the ontological shift. This is real. There's a realism here. It's a new center of gravity, and we're gonna keep falling and stumbling because we're not getting that we're entangled in that way, or we're going to start doing better because we're really getting that we're entangled that way, and we're creating our society differently, we're relating to each other differently, so it's all, I mean, that our agency in this is important, how we respond to that reality that you're talking about. So yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. So then I have Sue, then Adrian, and then Rosie. Okay, Sue, go ahead.
So Jeremy, thank you so much. And I'm just wanting to give you some feedback, as I've lived a while, and I want to tell you, you have such a good mind, the way you can use language so well. And like when you might use a difficult word, you describe what it means so that we can get brought along with your thought. You speaking to us, like I share Veronica's enthusiasm that it's so wonderful that you came. And this is a gift you have, and I want to encourage you to go out and continue with this, to expose people to these ideas. You bring it together so well. It matches what we've been studying, or it goes along with what we've been studying at the TS. So it's just fabulous. And thank you. Over.
Thank you, Sue. Really appreciate that. Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to do this talk. I'm happy to come back anytime. I love doing this, and I do feel it is a bit of a vocation. Like, yeah, I better go keep talking about this, So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, and we can maybe at the end say that you are teaching classes, because it does go with what we learn in Theosophy. Okay, Adrian, and then Rosie, go ahead.
So I want to agree with Sue that was a great presentation. Wasn't bored in the bit, and you could have gone on and on and on. I want to thank you. During your presentation, of course, I was thinking about all those guys I love, the German phenomenologists like Kant, who gave us categories. I was thinking about Heidegger, who brought us being and time and put us there. He was saying we were there. And of course, I was thinking about my favorite, Hegel, and who gave us the dialectics, the phenomenology, the movement, being, and very much of the way that Gebser describes it, and talks about the vanishing and the presencing and the delicacy of what it means to be in the now. So I guess my question, I have a question and a comment. My question is, how would you say that Gebser distinguishes himself from Hegel? Because you can see that he took a lot from these guys, and especially from Hegel.
Mm, mm. Good question. What's interesting is Gebser differentiates from Hegel pretty early on in that he's not attempting to describe a dialectic. He's very conscious of when it's employed. But for Gebser, this dialectical movement is still very much, in the center of gravity of the perspectival and the mental. And this kind of goes into some of his harder concepts that I'd be happy to unpack at some point. But he's interested in moving away from dialectical thinking and towards what he calls, here's the word, systasis and synairesis, which for him is not so much moving through the triad, right, of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but moving into something that is capable not of just 3 points or 4 points, but is more manifold and multidimensional. And that's the difficult part. That's really difficult to actually elucidate. But the way he talks about it is mental concepts that are coupled, quantitative concepts coupled with qualitative intensities. Can our philosophy accommodate that? Can our philosophy accommodate living systems, and not just systems? So yeah, he's very much interested in moving away from mere concept. He's interested in intensifying concept so that it becomes something more. I know that doesn't directly address this, but he's constantly pushing off of this isn't like Hegel. This isn't the dialectic. We're not talking about a dialectical process of history. These structures are ever present. So he's really saying we need a new conceptual framework of how this movement occurs. And he doesn't always answer it either. But he does attempt to differentiate and says it's what it's not. And he says it's not Hegel.
I'll take that into account because you know that Hegel was more than the dialectic, but I don't want to labor the point because he also had the logic and he had the actualization and he had the permanence that held itself together. My comment, I wanted to ask you because we were talking about senses. You distinguished the eye, for an example, from the hearing. And that made me think about something that we are reading in the Theosophical Society, and it's coming down to sound and the sound itself. And there was a Swiss linguist, Ferdinand Saussure, who looked at language and broke it down to phonetics. And for an example, even the Hebrew Torah or the language, the alphabet, the sound itself, the very basic phonetic is sacred, and that language has become contorted. I know you mentioned music, but I was wondering what you think. So when you said that sound, it's not as distinguishable, and I'm reading now that sound is in its very ultimate distinguishable, and we should start paying attention to the minutia of the language, especially in the sacred writing. Many people, practice ohms or the aleph and other kinds of parts of the alphabet.
Sure. Not so much that language or sound isn't distinguishable in the sense of a sound, an utterance that carries with it a potency and a power or a knowledge. But that sound, when you hear it, you're involved in the hearing of it. Even the invocation of Om, right, or the sacred vowels or the sacred pronunciations that bring the world into being. That's a participatory act. Gebser saying, when language becomes written, when alphabets become developed, they become much more atomized. Even the sacred text is still a text. So this is more of McLuhan territory in terms of the breaking down of oral culture into atomized language. But the potency of the word, that is a great way, or the syllable is a great way to literally attune to the power of language, of the spoken word, right? We're talking about a spoken embodied word, a word that must be expressed with our bodies and not just read silently. So I'd make that distinction, right? Like the invention and innovation of the alphabet, which enables us to do more with language in a more abstract sense, is a little bit different than the oral cultures, which use language, like you're saying, in a much more powerfully potent, magic and mystical sort of way. So yeah, I would make that distinction, but it's still a very interesting road to go down in terms of exploring it, because a word that is spoken, a word that is read and conceived are they could be very different things. They can interrelate with one another, but they do speak to these different structures of consciousness, moving from magic later into mental. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Rosie, go ahead. You are next. And then I have a few things from the chat.
Thank you, Jeremy. This was masterful. I read Gebser, I think it maybe was 10 years ago. And, you know, at the time, it's very difficult. Gebser is obviously very deep. And I'm just so impressed how you were able to touch on these ideas and summarize, and that I actually seem to retain some of it. So thank you. So my question, I have two, but one of my questions, and I don't know if it's something that Gebser himself wrote about, or if anyone has written about this, but I was thinking, you know, as we're talking about these states of consciousness and the fact that they are all latent in the present moment, I was thinking about, you know, whether we could, similar to how Susanna said, you know, she went to look at art objects to try to get an idea of what Gebser was talking about. I wonder if, like, similarly, we could sort of try to conceptualize what these states of consciousness are like through, like, the human life cycle, where, you know, from an infant stage, it's almost as though you are in that that archaic stage where, you know, consciousness is there, but it is not yet differentiated. But then as, you know, the human child becomes more aware of its environment, there's sort of this gradual, if you can remember back that far, this gradual concretization of first relationships, and, you know, that there is something separate from you, and then objects. And then, you know, that could move into the adult stage where, you know, it's more of a mental existence. Of course, we don't yet know what the integral is because we have not yet made that mutation. But did Gebser actually talk about that? Or, you know, has anyone ever spoken of these types of stages in that respect?
Sure, great question. You know, I think Wilbur really looks at this particularly. He takes a very developmental approach to Gebser's work, and it makes some very interesting comparisons here. And there's a lot of fruitful discussion and research about stages of development and how that is analogous to you know, our own personal development in terms of, you know, especially in the integral world, there's a focus on adult development, but they look at Piaget and some of these folks and compare them to Gebser and to other thinkers in developmental psychologists. So there's that world. In Gebser's own writing, he does talk a bit about how, you know, what happens in the macro is also what happens in the micro, or like to us as individuals. I would say, you know, we have to hold it a little carefully because in some ways, looking at the structures like that is very fruitful in terms of we participate as children. We go through those phases of differentiation. We go through a phase where the inner imagination is just very powerfully involved in the outer world, and they're kind of not really differentiated. So that's definitely there. I would say that childhood development or human individual development is something that participates in these structures. The mistake that I see often in the, let's say, the developmental perspective is there's a kind of reductive quality where, okay, that means earlier societies were kind of childlike, right? And you lose a sense of the sophistication and mastery that earlier structures really built the world with, right? I mean, if we look at how just historically how upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were masterful curators of their environment without needing to be farmers. They're basically like pyromasters, where they would do controlled burns, introduce organisms to ecosystems, work with the timing of different herds. They didn't need a farm. The whole environment was this like kind of craft for them. And their attunement to that mythic and magical potency of spell crafting, or the sensitivities of that kind of mythical time, is something we don't have as much, right? So it's not as linear. When it comes to children and our own personal development, I think it's a little easier to see, okay, when you're a kid, you can't really differentiate, and you really need some help with that kind of stuff. So you can kind of see the linearity a little bit more. But the interesting thing for me is like the mental and adulthood really work well together, particularly the adult kind of spiritual crisis of like really losing a connection with soul making or your interior world, or feeling like you're kind of rigidifying. There's a kind of leap that I think is more of a choice for adult development, to sort of making that integral leap, which is sort of a spiritual choice. And I find that to be really analogous to what Gebser's talking about with the structures of consciousness, right? That we can ossify and crystallize. And there's also this introduction or capacity to go like, well, maybe we can learn to cultivate ego freedom somehow. Maybe there is a way to develop self-transparency that's very important. So the analogies between the individual and these structures are very much there. There's just a lot of nuance, and being sure not to like reduce entire societies in the history of consciousness, which I'm constantly reminding my integral theory friends about. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does, absolutely. Thank you, because I hadn't thought yet about the integral being a part of our development just yet. But so this integral mutation, if I remember correctly, Gebser didn't seem necessarily optimistic we would make it. Is that the case? That
He was
it's
very
kind of-
stern. Yeah, he was very stern about it. And sometimes bordering on the prophetic and eschatological here and there, where he basically says, if we don't realize this mutation in the positive, it will realize us or undo us, right? Like we will like live and die by the sword in a way. Either we will figure this out or it will figure us out. And there's this kind of feeling of that threshold being like dangerous, like not a given, not a promise. But on the flip side, I think there was this kind of deep compassion he had, where like there's ways to live tomorrow, right? Whether or not we make it as a whole, there are ways we can live the future in the present and be integral human beings presently. Whether or not the entire human species comes along with that, it's a big question. It's a really big question. And I really appreciate that about him, because it's not a given. There's so much of an invitation to participate, and an importance of that participation at a collective and individual level. He's not saying it's a given, or that the world's just getting better, or like we're moving into a some kind of greater spiritual age that's just gonna be like. Those themes are here. They're coming whether or not we're ready. Transparency, integrality, entanglement we were talking about before. But we have a much more participatory agentic role in like how that ends up being. Like it could be a collapse. The integral could realize itself through our undoing, or it could realize itself through our mastery of it, or somewhere in between. So yes, it's very open-ended.
Well, thank you so much for answering that. So I have three quick questions, or one quick question from the chat. Gwen is our Jungian and astrologer, but she had to leave. And she said, you mentioned that Gebser was at Ernos lectures of Jung's group, and she was wondering if he himself was a lecturer, because then she would be able to access them, those lectures. Do you know by any
I believe he was. I haven't read anything explicitly about Eranos talks from Gebser, but I believe he was. I would check that out. I would say go find out for us.
Okay, I will tell
See
Glenn.
if they're there. See if they're in the archives.
Okay, and then Ria says, thank you. I got stuck on the idea of skandhas when you were talking form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. And I think there is a correlation, but this is bigger or more integral. Also wondering if the shifts are related to a sense of destructiveness. So we see a new way of destroying, and then with that consciousness, there's a new way of beginning. Yes.
Good question. On the skandhas, that's interesting. You know, a good book that talks about that is William Irwin Thompson's Coming into Being, where he's sort of looking at the evolution of consciousness and the skandhas. I'll defer to Thompson to kind of go into that a little bit, but I think there is a correlation there for sure. Also wondering if the shifts are related to a sense of destructiveness. I mean, very much. And I think that the kind of mythologies of, let's say, the mythic into the mental age are really illustrative. A lot of myths have like a kind of founding of the world from order into chaos, from chaos into order, right? A kind of a wrestling of powerful sea monsters, let's say Odysseus, right? So there's this kind of wrestling with the psyche in the mythic ocean, the Oceanos, right? And sort of standing apart from it. And Gebser talks even a little bit about how Christianity is this great, for him, myth and religion are not necessarily synonymous. Christianity is very much a mental expression of the logos of Christ, who stands above the water, right? Who's able to stand above. So there is a sense of a kind of a rescuing from the psychistic waters of the psychistic flood. So there is this element of destructiveness in these mutational periods. I think if that's where you're getting at, Ria, listening to the recording, the founding of a new world, bringing about of a new consciousness is very much a dramatic period of upheaval, instability, learning the hard way, like really kind of as the old ground falls out from underneath us, we search for new ground. And we keep realizing like there are deeper layers of the old ground we were still leaning on, and they're still falling, right? And I think we're experiencing that right now, how much can fall apart, and how much we were actually depending on with the old structure. So it's a real fundamental and dramatic and difficult period that we're living through, obviously. So I hope that answers the question a little bit, but I certainly think the destruction and creation dynamic is very much there in these mutational periods.
Yeah. And you address that in your book, the decay
Mm-hmm.
Of each structure of consciousness. So there's another question. I have a thought for the experience that outside of the timeline would integrational memory float float there?
So sorry, what was the question? I got it. For the experience that the outside of the timeline would intergenerate. Oh, yes. Intergenerational memory, I would certainly say, is magic and mythic in the sense of ancestors. And we have to remember, like, magic is very embodied. Each of the structures are very embodied. Even the abstract mental is a very kind of embodied cognition. Lakoff and Johnson talk about that a lot in more contemporary sense. But yeah, I mean, outside of the timeline, I'm not exactly sure what you mean there, but certainly, your genetics, your body, your ancestors, in a sense, are participating in life through you. And, you have access if you have the proper ritual and relationship and you do that. I would say, yeah, there's a possibility of developing that relationship, that intergenerational memory, and help shape who you are. That's like extending this concept of the latent past beyond your individuality and then into your family legacy. And that's certainly true. I mean, I think a lot of us know that from personal experience, not just how we were raised and what family members raised us, but also like some interesting baggage that comes up sometimes, some themes and issues that show up sometimes. I think a lot of shamanic work and magic work has to do with navigating demands and traumas and questions of the ancestors that are involved in your life, sometimes for the good and sometimes like in the way, sometimes you got to tell a great aunt, like, give me some space, and that kind of work is always going on in a lot of indigenous cultures. So not sure if that exactly answers there, but.
Well, thank you so much. There are comments in the chats, but not real questions, and I can send it out.
Susanna, can I have a question, please?
Yes, Alma, go ahead.
Oh yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for this amazing talk. I'm interested, like hearing these stages of consciousness. I sort of like hear a lot of alchemy through like the archaic consciousness, like primal materia, and just and it's sort of like it really shines through to me, like. And I'm interested in like like the mental stage, the buffering. It seems to be like a needed stage, but it's also then kind of like cuts us off from the integral stuff. And I guess in the integral consciousness, or like in the mental stage, where I guess Nietzsche said God is dead to some degree, And I'm just interested now in the integral stage. Is this kind of like a new rediscovering God to some degree? That a kind of sacredness again. And yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's what my question is. Like this type of as a culture, we have lost this sacred thing. It's kind of like, well, we have to make money, so we chop the forest down, and kind of like there's nothing sacred anymore because of this economic type of reasons, So in one way, I think it's like, have we lost it, and we need to sort of rediscover it? But in one way, I guess we can't go back to this childlike God. We have to kind of create as of a different way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, good topic. That's like that could be a whole other presentation, right? But yes, this is something that the Gebser is very concerned about, and to kind of speak actually about Heidegger, and a lot of the existentialists, Gebser does comment on them quite a bit. He finds Heidegger to be an almost like a prototypical integral thinker. He says he's at the threshold of something, but the feeling of being thrown naked into the world, right? The mental structure at its sort of zenith point is really a sense of not having that mythic magic past. It's no longer accessible to us. We don't feel connected to the ancestors. We don't feel like we're participating in the world. We have our rationality. We have our separate self sense, but we also don't have a sense of that, once that's exhausted, we don't have a sense of the future anymore. So there's a kind of a real listlessness of being thrown into being that the existentialists talk about, that is sort of part of this crisis. I think John Vervaeke calls it like the meaning crisis that our culture is wrestling with, right? The God is dead crisis. Yeah, I think for Gebser, that is the central concern of the integral, is how do we develop a new relationship with the spiritual? And for him, it's like, yeah, there is a kind of, first of all, as a prerequisite, something I explored in our one of our classes on integral practice. He doesn't give guidelines for what that looks like explicitly, but it is a subtext. It's kind of implicit. And part of what he says is we have to kind of loosen our fixation on the mental and perspectival world. And that requires us to really identify ourselves doing it, right? Doing the kind of sense making that the mental relies upon, and then actually like suspending disbelief and actually exploring the magic and mythic as well, and just really getting us flexible enough to kind of begin to oscillate between these different structures with sufficient equanimity, which is such a tall order when you're talking about like working with ancestors or like seriously considering, a kind of a plural ontology here of like the mythic and the magic being real, like actually entertaining that can help flex us a little bit. And he says, when you get to that, part of the work that you come to eventually is a sense of the whole, like moving back and forth between things, getting a sense of concretizing the magic and the mythic, even concretizing the mental to see it arise. Kind of like in meditation, they talk about more of the advanced form, like seeing yourself thinking, seeing your sense of self coagulating, right? Speaking of alchemy, there's a sense in which, like, if we can see ourselves shaping the mental, and also giving rise to the magic and the mythic, and see these dimensions in us in an interweaving kind of way, a living interdynamic way, there is the chance for the integral to kind of come forward, and the capacity to really open up in the present, right? But he says diaphany is the epiphany of the spiritual. So there is a sense of grace here too, right? Like there is a sense that even if we do all these things, like a contemplative might tell you, there's still that dark night. And I suppose we're kind of collectively in that dark night, that being has withdrawn, or the spirit has withdrawn. But we have to allow ourselves to be kind of prone to it. He talks about this. I'll leave you one word that would be the whole discussion that we could talk about. But he says, well, 3 words, sorry, but they're all related to the one word. Religion is a word, and religio, and how it used to mean different things. It used to mean, okay, to observe, to regard, religare, the mysteries, right? That means you're kind of engaged with enchantment, the spirit or spirits. Religio comes up with a different connotation in the mental structure, in that it's a binding back, right? Remember the mysteries. Go to church on Sunday. Move out of the secular day-to-day life and connect to these primal powers. So there's a kind of a threading back to those potencies, but eventually those tethers are destroyed. Religion kind of becomes empty, as we see it, especially in the West in the 19th century, 20th century. And for him, the only response is not to go back to religio or religare or religion, but to explore what he calls, and I love the phrasing here, beautiful phrasing, an obligation to the present, right? Preligio, he describes it as a becoming present. Like, you're not going to find it forward, you're not going to find it back. The only way through for the poor existentialist who has been thrown naked into being is to really learn to become present until the present becomes transparent to origin, which is a kind of a contemplative move. He's saying basically, we must become contemplative mystics in order to really kind of achieve this. But it's a beautiful kind of like rephrasing of that obligation. Rather than you're obligated to bind back, you're bound to the present, and as a choice, an obligation to regard the present. So I find that to be a really interesting orientation he offers us. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, he said, thank you so much. So there's nobody else. I just wanted to you addressed this in your book, Seeing Through the World. And unfortunately, his lectures have not been translated. I read them. And one of the ones that I love is the one, Polarity versus Duality. That's when I heard it the first time. Now, in philosophy, the way we interpret it is like, people do not understand they are one with each other and one with the divine, that it's just polarity. And as soon as they think they are separated from the divine or from each other, then that's duality. And in that lecture, Gebser emphasizes that we have to overcome the duality, understand the polarity, and that will help us to move into this integral phase. I know we have, so if there's anything you can say to that, and then we can finish. It was just wonderful, absolutely wonderful to have you here. Jeremy?
Thanks, Suzanne.
Yes.
Duality and polarity. I think my recommendation is always to kind of in a way, it's kind of like active imagination, like Jung talks about. Act as if these things have their own autonomy and are talking to you in terms of, like, your inner dialogue or speaking with mythic images. I think we have to work with polarity and duality as a practice, and really kind of familiarize ourselves what it would mean for opposites to be complementary in our everyday life, to really kind of feel those rhythms and how they sustain and make the world and sustain and make time in our being. And then also like feel how they can fall apart, how the instability of the dialectical opposition, is really kind of like a creative and fruitful kind of space of tension and destruction and recreation, right? Like synthesis is only temporary. I don't know if that's directly answering your question about duality and
I just wanted to have your thoughts on that. I mean, in your
yeah,
you pointed out this either or. It's not either or. It's as well as. You translate,
yeah,
differently, but that's the thing. Well,
yeah.
if you have any concluding remarks, I just wanted to say that one of your students said, "Thank you, Jeremy, awesome," and she wanted to say that I can highly recommend the neural learning
Oh, thank you, Ramona.
course. And then Veronica also said that you can join for $1. The what is it? The
Oh yeah,
Patreon.com.
I'll send a
Patreon.
link.
yeah,
Yes.
I'll post a link in the chat here.
yes.
Here's Patreon, and
And
then
when are you going to? When is your next book coming out?
sometime in the late spring. I need to finish the writing and then the editing process with my editors. But Fragments of an Integral Future, or Fragments of an Integral Futurism, and that book is very much a kind of expansion of the last chapter in my book where I'm like looking at the contemporary. It's a book about that. It's like, let's really look at what's going on now and today, and it's also a kind of revision of not necessarily Gebser's work per se, but contemporary, let's say, studies in the Paleolithic. I'm really trying to bring Gebser's understanding, which is less linear, into some contemporary research and its relevance for the present and our current crisis. And yes, there's an essay towards the end about technology and futurism and spirituality. So it's very much a kind of a wrestling with reclaiming time, as I say in the subtitle there. So yeah, it's an engagement with the present for sure. But yeah, the two ways to connect. Sorry?
Yeah. You have perspective as well.
Oh yeah. I'm working on a couple of essays with Perspectiva, and maybe a book at the end of 20. We'll see how this actually plays out. I have a feeling it'll be like 2022, but they want me to write a book on planetary mythopoetics, and we'll see how that shapes out. It's a draft of an outline of an idea at the moment. But that should be fun. I just want to mention I linked to my Patreon. If you're not interested or don't have time to take a full course, or if you just want to find a sustained way to engage with our community, we have got a great little cohort. We have these Wednesday Patreon Zoom calls, and we also do just sort of a lot of private Discord talks. There can be one-on-one talks. I don't know if you use Discord, but it's kind of like a chat room server. I post a lot of links. I'm always lurking in there. There's a lot of folks who are friends who are researchers or doing their PhD. So it's kind of like a study hub for this stuff if you're interested. And I try to be as accessible as possible for that. And then there is a course, as you mentioned, on February 21st we start. And what we're going to do is read through most of, but not all of, Ever Present Origin. And I say that because I know reading through the whole thing cover to cover is intimidating. But what I'm going to do is what I've done is selected curated chapters to read through, sort of the highlights. There's still a good amount of material to read through, but basically I'm going to be emphasizing where Gebser talks about the structures, and then in part 2 of the book where he's talking about kind of contemporary history and our wrestling with time and some of the main beats. I try to cover all the main beats to make EPO accessible. There's pre-recorded modules, so I already have lectures done, and then we also have a nice little class forum, and we'll be meeting pretty much bi-weeklies on Sundays to talk about the assigned reading. So if you're interested in deep diving with me, that'd be the place to do it.
Well, thank you so much. There was one person who wanted to ask a question, but I guess she had to get off. Jeremy, I don't know. I don't have anything to add. I am so glad that you were with us. And you really, as Rosie pointed out, and Veronica, Gebser is not that easy to read, and you were able to really bring it for us so that we can understand it. And I'll talk to others. I wish I would have convinced you to do an hour and a half, but it turned out to be much longer. But maybe we can have you again, and especially with emphasis on the integral phase. That's it. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you so much. See you Wednesday.